Sometimes the most profound moments in life arrive disguised as ordinary encounters. In a dusty Arizona border town where ancient traditions clash with modern prejudices, three lives are about to intersect in ways that will challenge everything they believe about strength, love, and what it truly means to protect family. Sarah Mitchell thought she had it all figured out. A successful real estate agent from Phoenix with designer clothes and city sophistication, she came to Wilcox with one goal: close the ranch deal and get back to civilization. The last thing she expected was to find herself drawn into a world where a quiet cowboy's gentle wisdom would unlock secrets she never knew existed within herself. But, when Maria Yazzie, a towering Apache woman whose presence commands respect from everyone in town, discovers something that will change not just her own life but the destiny of two unlikely strangers, the real story begins. This isn't just about overcoming prejudice or finding unexpected love. This is about the moment when three people realize that the families we choose can be stronger than the ones we're born into, and that sometimes the greatest courage comes from admitting we were completely wrong about everything we thought we knew. What happens when a woman who has spent her entire life building walls discovers that the very people she dismissed hold the keys to her future? The answer lies in a journey that will transform not just hearts and minds, but an entire community's understanding of what family really means. Sarah Mitchell's BMW struggled against the desert wind as she pulled into Wilcox, Arizona, the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the blazing afternoon sun. The GPS had led her down increasingly questionable roads until she found herself in what could generously be called the main street of a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Dust devils danced between weathered buildings, and the few people she could see moved with the unhurried pace of those who had nowhere urgent to be. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing her blonde hair back into its perfect style and adjusting her cream-colored blazer. The monthly sales meeting in Phoenix seemed like a world away from this place where pickup trucks outnumbered cars 10-1 and every building looked like it had been baking in the sun since the 1950s. The Hendricks Ranch property had been on the market for 18 months, and Sarah's real estate firm had finally gotten the listing after the previous agent gave up trying to find a buyer for 1,500 acres of what most people considered worthless desert. But Sarah had done her homework. The land sat perfectly positioned for the expansion of a major solar farm project, and she had a California investment group ready to close at asking price if she could just get the stubborn rancher to sign the papers. She parked in front of Murphy's General Store, a building that looked like it had survived the Apache Wars and several economic depressions. The wooden porch creaked under her heels as she approached the screen door, trying to ignore the curious stares from two elderly men playing checkers in the shade. Inside, the store felt like stepping into a museum of rural life. Shelves lined with everything from horse feed to homemade preserves created narrow aisles that smelled of leather and coffee. Behind the counter, a woman with steel-gray hair looked up from a ledger book, her weathered hands moving the pencil with practiced efficiency. "You must be the real estate lady from Phoenix," the woman said without preamble, her accent carrying the slow cadence of someone who had spent decades in small-town Arizona. "I'm Betty Murphy. Heard you were coming to see old Jake Hendricks about his place." Sarah forced her brightest professional smile, the one that had closed million-dollar deals in Scottsdale. "Sarah Mitchell, pleased to meet you. I was hoping you could give me directions to the ranch. My GPS seems to think it's somewhere in the middle of nowhere." Betty's laugh carried the sound of someone who had heard similar complaints from city folk before. "Honey, you're looking at the middle of nowhere right here. Jake's place is another 20 minutes south, but you'll want to take the old mining road. The main highway's been torn up for months." As Betty drew a rough map on the back of a receipt, Sarah became aware of other conversations happening around the store. Near the back, by a display of work gloves and rope, she could hear two men talking in low voices about someone named Jake and whether he was finally ready to sell. "Been stubborn as a mule about that land," one of them said, his voice carrying the resigned tone of someone who had watched the same drama play out for years. "His daddy fought the government over water rights, and Jake's been fighting developers ever since." "Can't blame him," the other replied. "That land's been in his family since before statehood. But a man's got to be practical sometimes." Sarah pretended to examine a display of local honey while listening, gathering intelligence the way she always did before important negotiations. Understanding the emotional attachments people had to property often made the difference between a successful deal and months of frustration. "Jake's a good man," Betty said quietly as she handed over the hand-drawn map. Lost his wife about 5 years ago, and it's been just him and his cattle since then. He's not much for talking to strangers, especially ones trying to buy his land." The warning in Betty's voice was gentle but clear. Sarah had encountered resistant sellers before, usually older men who had built their identities around the land they owned. The key was finding what they valued more than the property itself, whether that was financial security, family legacy, or simply respect. "I understand his reluctance," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm hoping we can find a solution that works for everyone involved." Betty nodded, though her expression suggested she had heard similar promises from other developers over the years. "The road can be tricky if you're not used to it. Stay on the main track, and don't try any shortcuts. Desert's not forgiving to folks who get lost." 20 minutes later, Sarah was beginning to understand what Betty had meant about the road being tricky. What had started as a paved surface had quickly deteriorated into graded dirt, then into something that might charitably be called a trail. Her BMW, designed for smooth highways and city streets, protested with every pothole and wash crossing. The landscape around her stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered mesquite trees and the occasional hawk circling overhead. Mountains rose in the distance like purple shadows, and she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon despite the brilliant sunshine where she drove. When she finally spotted buildings ahead, her first thought was relief that she had found the right place. Her second thought was concern about whether Jake Hendricks was the kind of person who would appreciate her straightforward business approach or if this would require more delicate handling than she had anticipated. The ranch buildings clustered around a modest house that had clearly been expanded several times over the decades. A large barn dominated one side of the compound, its metal roof gleaming in the afternoon sun, while several smaller outbuildings suggested this was a working operation rather than a hobby farm. What caught her attention most, however, was the man working near a corral where several horses stood in whatever shade they could find. Even at a distance, she could see he was tall and lean, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this environment. He wore the uniform of working cowboys everywhere, faded jeans, boots, and a hat that had seen better years. Sarah parked near the house and stepped out of her car, immediately feeling the heat rise from the ground in waves. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the sparse vegetation and the distant lowing of cattle. The cowboy had noticed her arrival but continued working, apparently in no hurry to play host to unexpected visitors. She could see him checking the fence line of the corral, his movements methodical and unhurried. Taking a deep breath and smoothing her blazer one more time, Sarah walked toward him, her heels sinking slightly into the sandy soil with each step. This was always the crucial moment in any negotiation, the first impression that would set the tone for everything that followed. "Excuse me," she called out when she was close enough to speak without shouting. "Are you Jake Hendricks?" The man turned toward her, and Sarah found herself looking into eyes the color of desert sky, weathered face showing lines earned through decades of sun and wind. He was younger than she had expected, probably somewhere in his 40s, with the kind of quiet presence that suggested he was more comfortable with animals than people. "Depends on who's asking," he replied, his voice carrying a slight drawl that seemed to go with the landscape. "Sarah Mitchell, Mitchell Realty in Phoenix. I believe you've been expecting me?" Jake nodded slowly, removing his work gloves and tucking them into his back pocket. "The lady who wants to buy my ranch." "Yeah, I've been expecting you." Something in his tone suggested this was not necessarily a good thing, but Sarah had dealt with reluctant sellers before. The key was establishing rapport while demonstrating that she understood the value of what they were considering selling. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "I know this kind of decision isn't easy." Jake shook her hand, his calloused palm briefly engulfing her manicured fingers. "Most decisions aren't, especially ones involving family land." "I understand this property has been in your family for generations," Sarah said, launching into the approach she had rehearsed during the drive. "That kind of history creates deep emotional connections that go far beyond simple financial considerations." "Is that your way of saying you think I'm being sentimental about dirt and rocks?" The question carried a challenge that Sarah recognized immediately. This wasn't going to be the straightforward business discussion she had hoped for. Jake Hendricks was clearly someone who saw through polite professional language and preferred direct communication. "Not at all," she replied carefully. "I think you're being protective of something that represents your family's legacy. But I also think you might be interested in hearing about an opportunity that could honor that legacy while providing financial security for your future." Jake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Behind him, one of the horses whinnied softly, and Sarah could hear the sound of cattle somewhere in the distance. "Tell you what," he said finally. "Why don't you come up to the house, and we can talk about this properly? But I should warn you, I've heard promises from developers before." As they walked toward the house, Sarah found herself paying attention to details she hadn't noticed from the car. The buildings were old but well-maintained, suggesting that Jake took pride in his property despite its isolation. Solar panels on the barn roof indicated he wasn't completely resistant to modern technology, and the corrals showed signs of recent repair work. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, trying to establish common ground. "All my life, except for 4 years in the army. Came back when my father needed help with the operation, and I've been here ever since." "It must be peaceful," Sarah said, though privately she couldn't imagine living so far from civilization. "It is when people aren't trying to buy it out from under me." The house was larger inside than it appeared from outside, with rooms added as the family had grown and prospered. The living room featured comfortable furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, and the walls displayed photographs spanning several generations of the Hendricks family. Sarah accepted Jake's offer of coffee and found herself sitting across from him at a kitchen table that had clearly seen decades of use. Through the window, she could see the barn and corrals, with the vast desert stretching beyond toward the distant mountains. "So," Jake said, settling back in his chair with his coffee mug, "tell me about this opportunity that's supposed to honor my family's legacy." Sarah opened her portfolio and began explaining the solar farm project, emphasizing the environmental benefits and the potential for the land to continue serving a useful purpose rather than being developed for housing or commercial use. She had researched the talking points carefully, knowing that environmental stewardship often resonated with ranchers who understood the importance of caring for the land. But, as she spoke, she could see that Jake was listening with the polite attention of someone who had already made up his mind. His responses were courteous but minimal, and she could sense that her carefully prepared presentation was falling flat. "The investment group I represent is prepared to offer full asking price," she concluded, naming a figure that represented a substantial sum for rural property. "They understand the value of what you've built here, and they're committed to maintaining the integrity of the land while putting it to productive use." Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window toward his cattle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that Sarah hadn't expected. "Ms. Mitchell, I appreciate that you've done your homework, and I'm sure your clients are good people with honorable intentions. But this isn't just land to me. This is where my grandfather proved up his homestead claim. This is where my father built the first windmill that meant we didn't have to haul water for the cattle. This is where I married my wife and where we plan to raise our children." "I understand the emotional attachment," Sarah began, but Jake held up a hand. "Do you? Because it seems to me like you see acreage and mineral rights and development potential. Which is fine, that's your job. But I see home." Sarah felt her professional composure beginning to slip. She had encountered emotional resistance before, but something about Jake's quiet dignity made her usual arguments seem inadequate. "Mr. Hendricks, I'm not trying to minimize what this place means to you. But I also think it's worth considering what your wife would have wanted. Would she have wanted you to struggle alone out here when you could have financial security and the chance to start over somewhere else?" The change in Jake's expression was immediate and unmistakable. The polite distance was replaced by something much colder, and Sarah realized she had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. "You don't know anything about my wife or what she would have wanted," he said quietly, but his voice carried a warning that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "I didn't mean to presume," she said quickly. "I just thought that sometimes practical considerations have to outweigh emotional ones." "Is that what you think this is? Emotion overriding common sense?" Sarah could feel the negotiation slipping away from her, but she pressed on, driven by the commission this sale would generate and the recognition it would bring within her firm. I think you're a man who's been through a difficult loss, and sometimes grief can make us hold on to things that might not be in our best interests long term. Jake stood up from the table, his movement deliberate and controlled. I think this conversation is over, Ms. Mitchell. Please, just consider the offer. You don't have to decide today. I already have decided. The answer is no. Sarah gathered her portfolio, her mind racing through alternative approaches. She had been counting on this sale, had already spent the anticipated commission in her head. Her supervisor had made it clear that landing the Hendricks property would be a career-defining achievement. Mr. Hendricks, I understand this is emotional for you, but, emotions aside, this is a generous offer for property that's been on the market for over a year. Maybe you should think about why that is. Jake walked to the front door and opened it, clearly indicating that their meeting was over. Maybe you should think about why a man might value something more than money. As Sarah walked back to her car, she could feel frustration and embarrassment building in equal measure. She had handled the entire conversation wrong, allowing Jake's resistance to push her into arguments that had only made things worse. Starting her BMW, she sat for a moment looking back at the house where Jake had already disappeared inside. The desert heat was becoming oppressive, and storm clouds were building more rapidly on the horizon. She had driven halfway back to town when the first drops of rain hit her windshield, and, by the time she reached the main road, the storm had arrived in earnest. Desert rain was unlike anything she had experienced in Phoenix, coming down in sheets that turned the dirt road into a treacherous mud track. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and Sarah found herself driving by instinct and hope rather than clear sight of the road ahead. When her wheels began sliding on the increasingly muddy surface, she realized she was in serious trouble. The BMW came to rest at an angle in what had been a dry wash but was rapidly becoming a rushing stream of runoff from the surrounding hills. Sarah tried to restart the engine, but it coughed once and died, leaving her stranded in a landscape that had transformed from harsh but manageable to actively dangerous in a matter of minutes. Her cell phone showed no signal, which she probably should have expected but somehow hadn't considered. The rain continued to pound against her car, and she could see that the water in the wash was rising steadily. For the first time since arriving in Wilcox, Sarah began to understand that her city skills and professional confidence meant nothing in an environment that played by completely different rules. As she sat in her disabled car, watching the storm rage around her, she couldn't help thinking about Jake Hendricks' quiet confidence and his obvious comfort with challenges that would have intimidated most people. She was still thinking about the cowboy she had dismissed as stubborn and emotional when she saw headlights approaching through the storm, moving with the steady purpose of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The pickup truck that emerged from the storm looked like it had been designed specifically for this kind of weather. High clearance, heavy-duty tires, and a driver who clearly understood how to navigate flooding desert washes. Sarah watched through her rain-streaked windshield as the vehicle positioned itself upstream from her stranded BMW, and her heart sank when she recognized the familiar silhouette of Jake Hendricks climbing out of the driver's seat. Of all the people who could have come to her rescue, it had to be the man she had just insulted and dismissed. The irony was almost too perfect, like something from a movie where the universe enjoyed teaching lessons to people who thought they had everything figured out. Jake approached her car wearing a heavy rain slicker, his boots splashing through water that was now ankle-deep around her vehicle. When he tapped on her window, Sarah reluctantly rolled it down, immediately getting soaked by the driving rain. "Engine flooded?" he asked without preamble, having to raise his voice over the sound of rushing water. "I think so. It just died when I tried to drive through the water." Jake nodded, apparently unsurprised by this turn of events. "Water gets into the air intake, and the engine dies. Happens to city folks all the time." There was no mockery in his voice, but Sarah felt her cheeks burn anyway. "I suppose you're enjoying this." "Ma'am, I don't enjoy seeing anyone in danger, regardless of our previous conversation. This wash can go from empty to 6 feet deep in less than an hour when the rains come hard." As if to emphasize his point, Sarah could see debris floating past her car, branches, pieces of fence, and what looked like part of someone's roof. The water was definitely rising, and she was beginning to understand that this was genuinely dangerous rather than merely embarrassing. "What do I need to do?" she asked, surprised by how quickly her professional pride had given way to practical concern for her safety. "First, you're getting out of that car before it gets swept downstream. Second, we're getting you back to the ranch until this storm passes." Sarah hesitated for a moment, thinking about her designer shoes and the dignity she had already lost today. Then, she looked at the rushing water and realized that dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford in her current situation. Jake helped her out of the BMW, steadying her when she slipped on the muddy bank of the wash. His grip was firm and sure, and Sarah found herself grateful for his calm competence in dealing with what was clearly a crisis situation. "What about my car?" she asked as they made their way toward his pickup. "It'll either still be here when the water goes down, or it'll be in Mexico by morning. Either way, there's nothing we can do about it now." The ride back to the ranch was conducted in relative silence, broken only by Jake's occasional warnings about rough spots in the road and Sarah's muttered thanks for his help. She was acutely aware of how out of place she looked in his truck, her business attire soaked and muddy, her carefully styled hair hanging in wet strings around her face. When they reached the ranch buildings, Jake pulled up close to the house and turned off the engine. The storm seemed even more intense here, with wind driving the rain in horizontal sheets across the open ground. "You'll need dry clothes and hot coffee," Jake said as they hurried toward the front door. "Storm like this usually lasts a couple hours, but the roads won't be passable until tomorrow morning at the earliest." Sarah stopped short at the implication. "You mean I'm stuck here overnight?" "Unless you want to try walking back to town in a flash flood, yes." Inside the house, Jake disappeared into what Sarah assumed was a bedroom and returned with an armload of clothing that looked like it would be several sizes too large for her. "These were my wife's," he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "She was taller than you, but they should work until your clothes dry out." Sarah accepted the bundle of clothing, feeling an unexpected wave of emotion at the gesture. After their earlier conversation, she would have understood if Jake had simply driven her to town and left her at the motel. Instead, he was offering her shelter and even lending her his deceased wife's clothes. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than she had meant anything all day. "I know this is awkward after our conversation earlier." "The desert doesn't care about our personal disagreements," Jake replied. "When someone needs help, you help them. Everything else can wait." The bathroom where Sarah changed clothes was simple but clean, with towels that smelled like desert air and sunshine. The clothes Jake had given her included jeans that were indeed too long and too loose, and a cotton shirt that hung on her like a tent. But they were dry and warm, and wearing them somehow made her feel more connected to this place and the people who called it home. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found Jake in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be a substantial meal rather than just coffee. The storm continued to rage outside, and the house felt like a secure island in the middle of chaos. "I figured you'd be hungry," he said without turning around. "Stress and adrenaline usually have that effect." "I feel like I should be helping somehow," Sarah said, though she had no idea what she could contribute to the simple efficiency with which Jake was handling the situation. "You can sit and tell me about Phoenix while I cook. I don't get much news from the outside world out here." As Jake worked at the stove, Sarah found herself talking about her life in the city in ways she rarely did with anyone. Maybe it was the clothes she was wearing, or the sound of rain on the roof, or simply the fact that normal social conventions seemed suspended in the middle of a desert storm. Whatever the reason, she heard herself describing not just her job but her frustrations with it, not just her apartment but how lonely it sometimes felt, not just her success but the pressure she felt to keep achieving more. "Sounds like you've built a good life for yourself," Jake said when she finished, but there was a question in his voice. "Sometimes I wonder if I've built a life or just a career," Sarah admitted. Today was supposed to be simple. Drive out here, close a deal, drive home. Instead, I ended up arguing with someone who was just trying to protect something important to him. Jake brought 2 plates to the table, each loaded with what looked like the best chicken and rice dish Sarah had ever smelled. "You weren't wrong about the practical aspects," he said as they began eating. "This place is a lot of work for one person, and the economics of small ranching aren't what they used to be. But I was wrong about what matters to you." I made assumptions based on what would matter to me in your situation. Most people do that. It's human nature to think everyone else sees the world the same way we do. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm outside and the comfortable sounds of the old house settling around them. Sarah found herself noticing details she had missed during her earlier visit: photographs on the refrigerator showing Jake and a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, books stacked on various surfaces suggesting someone who read widely and regularly, small touches throughout the house that spoke of a life lived with attention to beauty as well as function. She was lovely, Sarah said quietly, nodding toward one of the photographs. Elena. She was a teacher at the school in town. Taught second grade for 15 years and never met a child she couldn't reach somehow. How long were you married? 12 years. We kept thinking we'd have kids eventually, but it never happened. Then, the cancer came, and suddenly, time ran out faster than we expected. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest at the sadness in his voice. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought up what she would have wanted earlier. That was presumptuous and insensitive. Jake looked at her across the table, his expression thoughtful. Actually, you weren't entirely wrong. Elena did worry about me being out here alone. She used to say the land would take care of itself, but people need other people. So why haven't you sold? If she was concerned about you being isolated? Because selling would feel like giving up on everything we built together. This place represents our dreams, our plans for the future. Even though she's gone, I'm not ready to let go of that yet. Sarah found herself looking around the kitchen with new eyes, seeing not just an old house in the middle of nowhere but a home where two people had loved each other and planned a future that had been cut short by circumstances beyond their control. What if there was a way to honor those dreams without having to hold on to the physical property? She asked gently. What do you mean? The investment group I represent isn't just interested in the land for development purposes. They're looking for ways to create sustainable energy projects that benefit rural communities. What if part of the deal included funding for educational programs or community development projects in Elena's name? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering the possibility. You mean like a scholarship fund or something? Exactly. Or funding for classroom improvements, or educational programs about sustainable living and environmental stewardship. Ways to continue the kind of work Elena did, helping children learn and grow. That's not a bad idea, Jake admitted. But it still means giving up the land. It means transforming how the land serves its purpose. Instead of supporting just one family, it could support an entire community's future. Before Jake could respond, they were interrupted by a loud knocking at the front door. Both of them looked up in surprise. Who would be traveling in this kind of weather? Jake went to answer the door, and Sarah heard him greeting someone in a language she didn't recognize. When he returned to the kitchen, he was accompanied by a woman who was unlike anyone Sarah had ever encountered. She was extraordinarily tall, probably close to 6 feet, with the strong build of someone who had spent her life doing physical work. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and she wore jeans and boots that looked like they had seen serious use. But what struck Sarah most was the woman's presence, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room without any effort on her part. Sarah, this is Maria Yazzie, Jake said. Maria, this is Sarah Mitchell, the real estate agent I mentioned. Maria studied Sarah with dark eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. The one who got caught in the wash? That would be me, Sarah said, standing up and immediately feeling awkward in Elena's oversized clothes. Desert storms don't care about schedules, Maria said with a slight smile. Good thing Jake was paying attention. Maria runs the trading post and crafts cooperative in town, Jake explained. She also handles veterinary work for most of the ranchers in the area. Among other things, Maria added, accepting Jake's offer of coffee. I was checking on the Gonzalez family's place when I saw your lights and thought I'd make sure everyone was okay. As Maria settled at the table with them, Sarah found herself curious about this woman who seemed so completely at home in an environment that had challenged every assumption Sarah had about her own capabilities. Have you lived in Wilcox long? Sarah asked. All my life, except for college and veterinary school. Came back because the community needed someone with my training, and this is home. It must be different from what you experienced in college. Maria laughed, a rich sound that seemed to come from deep within her. You mean because I'm Apache living in a predominantly white rural community, or because I'm a woman doing work traditionally associated with men? Sarah felt her cheeks warm at having her assumptions called out so directly. I didn't mean to imply anything inappropriate. No offense taken. But, you'd be surprised how much the world has changed, even out here in the middle of nowhere. People care more about competence than they do about stereotypes when their animals need help or their business needs managing. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself drawn into conversations that ranged from local politics to sustainable ranching practices to the challenges facing rural communities in an increasingly connected world. Maria, she discovered, was not only a veterinarian but also served on the school board, managed a successful crafts cooperative that provided income for women throughout the region, and had recently been elected to the County Planning Commission. You're involved in everything, Sarah observed. When you live in a small community, everyone has to wear multiple hats, Maria replied. The alternative is watching everything fall apart because there's nobody willing to step up and do the work. That's one of the things I've been thinking about with regard to the ranch, Jake said, glancing at Sarah. If I did decide to sell, I'd want to make sure the new use of the land benefited the community rather than just extracting wealth from it. Maria looked between Jake and Sarah with obvious interest. Are you considering Sarah's offer? We were discussing some modifications that might address my concerns about community benefit, Jake said carefully. Such as? Sarah found herself explaining the scholarship and educational program ideas she had suggested earlier, watching Maria's expression for signs of interest or skepticism. Instead, she saw something that looked like approval. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of, Maria said when Sarah finished. Projects that serve multiple purposes and create benefits that last longer than the initial investment. You think it's a viable approach? Sarah asked. I think it's the only approach that makes sense for sustainable rural development. The old model of extractive industries that take wealth out of rural areas without giving anything back is what's been killing communities like ours for decades. As they continued talking, Sarah began to understand that she had stumbled into something much more complex and interesting than a simple real estate transaction. Both Jake and Maria were clearly people who thought deeply about their responsibilities to their community and their environment, and both seemed genuinely interested in finding solutions that served multiple purposes. What would Elena think about this kind of arrangement? Maria asked Jake gently. Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out the window where the storm was finally beginning to ease. She always said the best way to honor the past was to create a better future. I think she'd like the idea of the land continuing to serve education and community development. Then, maybe it's worth exploring more seriously, Sarah said. I could talk to my clients about structuring the deal to include substantial community development components. Before you get too far ahead of yourselves, Maria said with a slight smile, you might want to make sure you're all talking about the same thing. Jake's idea of community benefit might be different from Sarah's client's idea of acceptable project scope. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean that true community development requires ongoing consultation with the people who live here, not just one-time funding for projects designed by outsiders. If your investment group is serious about community benefit, they need to be prepared for a long-term partnership, not just a check-writing exercise. Sarah felt a familiar tension between her desire to close the deal and her growing understanding that the people she was dealing with were not going to be satisfied with cosmetic gestures toward community involvement. That's a fair point, she admitted. I'd need to discuss with my clients how much ongoing involvement they'd be willing to commit to. And we'd need to discuss what the community actually wants and needs, Maria added. Which means talking to more people than just Jake and me. You're talking about a much more complicated process than I originally envisioned, Sarah said. The best solutions usually are more complicated than we originally envision, Jake replied. But they also tend to last longer and serve more purposes. As the storm outside finally began to subside, Sarah found herself thinking about how much her perspective had changed since her arrival in Wilcox that morning. What had started as a straightforward business transaction had evolved into something that challenged her assumptions about community, about the relationship between economic development and social responsibility, and about her own role as someone who helped facilitate change in people's lives. "I should probably head home," Maria said, standing up from the table. "Roads should be passable by morning, and I've got early appointments." "It was really nice meeting you," Sarah said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Likewise. Jake, think about what we discussed. And, Sarah, if you're serious about community partnership, you might want to plan on spending more time here than just one afternoon." After Maria left, Jake and Sarah cleaned up the dinner dishes together, working with the easy cooperation of people who had shared a meaningful conversation. The storm had passed, leaving the night air clean and cool, and through the kitchen window Sarah could see stars emerging in the clearing sky. "She's remarkable," Sarah said as they finished putting dishes away. "Maria?" "Yeah, she is. The whole community relies on her in ways most people don't even realize." "How long have you known her?" "All my life. She's a couple years younger than me, but we went to school together until she left for college. When she came back with her veterinary degree, it was like the community had gained a secret weapon." Sarah found herself wondering what it would be like to be that essential to a place and the people in it. Her own life in Phoenix suddenly seemed disconnected and superficial by comparison. "Jake, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "Do you think Elena would want you to spend the rest of your life alone out here, maintaining something that's become more burden than blessing?" Jake considered the question seriously before answering. "I think Elena would want me to find a way to honor our life together while still building something meaningful for the future. Today, for the first time since she died, I'm beginning to think those two things might not be mutually exclusive." As Sarah settled into the guest room that night, wearing Elena's pajamas and listening to the desert silence that had replaced the storm, she realized that her life had taken an unexpected turn. Tomorrow she would have to call her office and explain why she was extending her stay in Wilcox. She would have to contact her clients and propose a more complex and uncertain deal structure than they had originally discussed. But, for the first time in years, she was excited about the possibilities that lay ahead rather than simply focused on the outcomes she was trying to achieve. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was that Maria Yazzie was exactly the kind of person she wanted to work with on whatever this project was becoming. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the sound of birds she couldn't identify singing somewhere outside. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the profound silence that surrounded the occasional bird calls. No traffic noise, no air conditioning units humming, no sounds of neighbors beginning their daily routines. Just desert quiet and the gentle movement of air through the open window. The events of the previous day came flooding back as she sat up in Elena's pajamas, looking around the guest room that felt both foreign and somehow welcoming. Her phone, charging on the nightstand, showed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages, mostly from her office wanting to know why she hadn't checked in after her appointment with Jake Hendricks. Before dealing with the professional crisis that was undoubtedly brewing, Sarah looked out the window toward the barn where she could see Jake already at work, moving among the cattle with the same unhurried competence he had shown during the storm. The morning light revealed the landscape in detail that had been obscured by yesterday's weather, and she was surprised by how beautiful the desert looked when it wasn't trying to kill her. She dressed in her own clothes, which Jake had somehow managed to clean and dry overnight, and made her way to the kitchen where she found coffee already prepared and a note explaining that he would be back around 9 o'clock to drive her to town to deal with her car situation. As she sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and red, Sarah realized that everything about this experience was forcing her to slow down and pay attention in ways that her normal life actively discouraged. In Phoenix, mornings were about efficiency and momentum, about getting caffeinated and connected and moving toward the day's objectives as quickly as possible. Here, mornings seemed designed for contemplation and observation, for noticing the way light changed the landscape and understanding how the day's weather might develop. Her phone rang, interrupting her uncharacteristic moment of reflection. The caller ID showed her supervisor's number, and Sarah knew she could no longer postpone the conversation she had been dreading. "David, I know you're concerned about yesterday's appointment." "Concerned?" David Morrison's voice carried the edge that appeared whenever one of his agents complicated what should have been straightforward transactions. "Sarah, you were supposed to be back in the office by 5 o'clock yesterday with signed papers. Instead, I've got radio silence for 18 hours and a client who's starting to ask questions about our reliability. There were some unexpected complications with the weather and, with the property owner's concerns about community impact. I think we need to modify our approach to this deal." "What kind of modifications?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would challenge every assumption David had about how real estate transactions should work. The landowner is interested in selling, but he wants guarantees that the development will include substantial community benefit components. Things like educational funding, local hiring requirements, and ongoing consultation with community leaders about implementation. "Sarah, we're not running a charity organization. We're representing investors who want a clean transaction with predictable returns." "I understand that, but I also think there's an opportunity here to structure something that serves everyone's interests while also creating goodwill that could benefit future projects in the region." David was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could almost hear him calculating the potential complications and costs associated with the kind of deal she was describing. "How long would this kind of negotiation take?" "I'm not sure yet. I need to meet with community leaders and better understand what kinds of partnerships would be meaningful to them." "And how long do you think our clients will wait while you conduct a sociological study of rural Arizona?" Sarah felt her professional instincts warring with the new perspective she had gained over the past 24 hours. 6 months ago, she would have agreed with David that community concerns were obstacles to overcome rather than opportunities to explore. "David, I think this could be a model for future rural development projects. If we can demonstrate that community partnership actually enhances rather than complicates project success, it could open up opportunities throughout the region. Or it could set a precedent that makes every future deal exponentially more complicated and expensive. Give me a week to explore the possibilities. If I can't structure something that works for everyone, we'll go back to the original approach." After some additional negotiation and several veiled threats about the consequences of pursuing dead ends, David agreed to give Sarah the week she had requested. But she knew that her professional future was now tied to her ability to prove that community partnership was practical as well as idealistic. Jake returned from his morning work as she was finishing her conversation with David, and she could see from his expression that he had overheard enough to understand she was dealing with resistance from her own organization. "Trouble from the home office?" he asked as he poured himself coffee. "They're concerned about the complexity and timeline of what we discussed last night. They want a simple transaction, not a community development project. Can't say I blame them. Business people like predictable outcomes. But, you still think the community benefit approach is worth pursuing?" Jake sat down across from her at the table, his expression thoughtful. "I think anything worth doing is worth doing right. Elena used to say that shortcuts usually end up costing more than doing things properly in the first place. My supervisor wants me to either close the deal this week or walk away from it." "And, what do you want?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In her professional life, what she wanted was usually synonymous with what her clients wanted, what her supervisors expected, and what would advance her career most effectively. She rarely considered her personal preferences as separate from those external pressures. "I want to understand what Maria meant last night about true community development requiring ongoing partnership. I want to know if there's really a way to structure projects that serve multiple purposes without becoming too complicated to implement. Then, maybe we should start by talking to more people in the community. Maria mentioned that any real partnership would require broader consultation. Would you be willing to help with that? I mean, would you introduce me to people and help me understand what the community actually needs?" Jake smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. "I think Elena would have liked you, once you stopped trying to buy her home out from under her." They spent the morning dealing with the practical aftermath of yesterday's storm. Sarah's BMW, they discovered, had indeed survived the night, though it required towing to the mechanic in town and would need several days of work before it was roadworthy again. "Rental car agency is in Tucson," the mechanic explained cheerfully. Jake here could probably loan you his wife's car if you're planning to stick around for a few days. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the casual mention of Elena, but Jake seemed untroubled by the suggestion. Car's just sitting in the garage, he said. Elena always said vehicles were meant to be driven, not preserved. Elena's car turned out to be a practical SUV that looked like it had been well maintained but regularly used. As Sarah adjusted the mirrors and seat, she found herself thinking about the woman who had last driven this vehicle, wondering what Elena had been like and whether she would have approved of the direction this whole situation was taking. Their first stop was Maria's trading post, a building that proved to be much larger and more sophisticated than Sarah had expected. The main retail space featured high-quality Native American crafts, books about regional history and culture, and practical items for rural living. But behind the retail area, Sarah could see offices and workshop spaces that suggested this was the headquarters for much more extensive operations. Maria was in the back office, talking on the phone in what Sarah assumed was Apache, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. She gestured for them to wait while she finished her conversation. Tribal council meeting, she explained when she hung up. We're discussing water rights issues that could affect ranchers throughout the region. I didn't realize tribal and rancher interests overlapped so much, Sarah said. They overlap more than most people realize. Water, grazing rights, environmental protection, economic development, we're all dealing with the same basic challenges, just from different starting points. Maria led them to a conference room where maps and charts covered one wall, showing what appeared to be various development projects and their potential impacts on regional resources. Jake tells me you're interested in exploring community partnership approaches to the solar farm project, Maria said without preamble. I'm trying to understand whether such approaches are practical or just idealistic thinking. They're both. The question is whether the practical challenges are worth overcoming in order to achieve the idealistic goals. For the next hour, Maria walked Sarah through examples of successful community development projects throughout the region, explaining how some had failed because they ignored community concerns while others had succeeded because they incorporated local knowledge and priorities from the beginning. The key, Maria said, pointing to a chart that showed the timeline of a wind farm project that had taken 5 years to complete but was still generating benefits 15 years later, is understanding that true partnership requires time and patience, but it creates much more sustainable outcomes. My clients are investors, not philanthropists, Sarah said. They need to see returns on their investment within reasonable timeframes. That's fine, as long as they understand that cutting corners on community consultation usually leads to delays, cost overruns, and sometimes project failure due to local opposition. Maria pulled out a folder containing studies of renewable energy projects throughout the Southwest, some of which had encountered significant problems because they had ignored community concerns. This wind farm in New Mexico took 3 years longer than planned and cost 30% more than budgeted because they didn't adequately consult with local ranchers about turbine placement and road construction. This one in Colorado had to completely redesign their transmission lines because they hadn't talked to tribal authorities about cultural sites. So community consultation is actually a business necessity, not just a nice gesture. Exactly. The question is whether you do it at the beginning when it's relatively easy and inexpensive, or at the end when it's complicated and costly. As they continued discussing specific approaches to community partnership, Sarah found herself taking notes and asking questions that went far beyond her original mandate to simply close a real estate deal. She was beginning to understand that what Jake and Maria were proposing could potentially transform how her clients approached rural development projects. There's something else we should discuss, Maria said as their formal meeting was winding down. Something that might affect the timeline for any major decisions about the ranch. Jake and Sarah both looked at her with interest, wondering what new complications were about to emerge. I'm pregnant, Maria said simply, her hand moving to her stomach in a gesture that seemed both protective and proud. Sarah felt her professional composure slip completely. Of all the potential complications she had been trying to anticipate, this was not one that had occurred to her. Congratulations, Jake said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. That's wonderful news. How does this affect the development project? Sarah asked, immediately regretting how clinical her question sounded. Maria laughed, apparently not offended by Sarah's focus on practical implications. It means that any partnership arrangement we develop needs to account for leadership transitions and the importance of creating sustainable systems rather than depending on individual personalities. Are you planning to step back from your community responsibilities? I'm planning to balance my responsibilities as they evolve. But this pregnancy has made me think more seriously about the kind of community we're creating for the next generation. As they left the trading post, Sarah found herself grappling with emotions she couldn't quite identify. Maria's pregnancy announcement had somehow made everything about this project feel more personal and more urgent. "She'll be a wonderful mother," Jake said as they drove toward their next appointment. "How can you tell?" "She's been taking care of this entire community for years. Adding her own child to that responsibility will just make her more motivated to create sustainable solutions." Their next stop was the school where Elena had taught, a modest building that served students from throughout the region. The principal, an energetic woman named Dr. Patricia Santos, greeted Jake with the familiarity of someone who had worked closely with Elena. "Jake's told me about your interest in educational funding as part of the land development project," Dr. Santos said as she showed Sarah around the school. "We've been operating on shoestring budgets for years, so any additional resources would be incredibly valuable." "What kinds of programs would be most beneficial?" Sarah asked, trying to understand what meaningful educational support would actually look like. "Technology infrastructure, expanded science programming, teacher professional development, and scholarships for graduates who want to pursue higher education but can't afford it." As they toured classrooms and talked to teachers about their needs and dreams for their students, Sarah began to understand the profound difference between writing a check for educational purposes and actually creating sustainable programs that would benefit students for generations. "Elena had such big dreams for our students," Dr. Santos said as they concluded their tour. "She always believed that rural kids could compete with anyone if they had access to the same opportunities. A project like you're describing could make those dreams reality." Their final appointment of the day was with Tom Gonzalez, whose family had been ranching in the area for 4 generations and who served as an informal spokesman for the agricultural community. "Jake tells me you're interested in doing this solar project right instead of just doing it fast," Tom said as they sat on his porch overlooking grazing land that stretched to the horizon. "I'm trying to understand what doing it right would actually involve," Sarah replied. "It involves understanding that this land supports a lot more than just whoever owns the title to it. My cattle graze on Jake's land during dry years, and his cattle graze on mine when my grass is better. Maria's trading post provides income for my wife's jewelry business. The school depends on all of us for support and volunteers. So any major change affects the entire network of relationships." "Exactly. Which doesn't mean change is bad, just that it needs to account for how everything connects to everything else." As they drove back toward Jake's ranch as the sun was setting, Sarah found herself processing the day's conversations and trying to understand how to translate what she had learned into language her clients would find compelling. "It's more complicated than I originally thought," she admitted to Jake. "Most worthwhile things are. But it's also more interesting, don't you think?" Sarah realized that he was right. The simple real estate transaction she had come to complete would have been forgotten within weeks of closing. But the community development project they were exploring had the potential to create changes that would last for decades. "Jake, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Go ahead." "Do you think Elena would approve of what we're trying to do here?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the road ahead as they approached the ranch buildings. "I think Elena would love that her home might become the foundation for programs that help children learn and grow. I think she'd be excited about Maria having a baby and about the possibility of creating a stronger community for that child to grow up in." "And what about us? I mean, what about the fact that I've basically moved in with a man I met yesterday in order to work on a project that might not even be possible?" Jake glanced at her with a slight smile. "I think Elena would say that the best things in life usually happen when we stop trying to control every outcome and start paying attention to the opportunities that present themselves." That night, as Sarah sat at Elena's kitchen table working on her laptop and creating presentations for clients who were 300 miles away, she realized that she was no longer thinking about this project as a real estate transaction that happened to include community benefits. She was thinking about it as a community development initiative that happened to involve the sale of land. The distinction seemed important, though she wasn't entirely sure why. What she did know was that she was more excited about her work than she had been in years, and that the excitement had everything to do with the people she was working with and the vision they were creating together. When Jake brought her a cup of tea and sat down across from her to review the day's notes, Sarah realized that somewhere in the past 48 hours, her life had taken a turn that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. She was living in a dead woman's clothes, sleeping in a stranger's house, and working on a project that challenged every assumption she had about business, community, and what success actually meant. "Jake," she said as they worked together on refining the community partnership proposal, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I think I'm falling in love with this place. And I think that might be affecting my judgment about whether this project is actually viable." Jake looked up from the documents they had been reviewing, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Sarah, falling in love with a place isn't a weakness. It's often the beginning of understanding what's really at stake in the decisions we make." 3 days later, Sarah found herself in the unique position of presenting the most unconventional business proposal of her career to a conference room full of investors who were accustomed to straightforward financial projections and predictable timelines. The video call from Jake's kitchen table to a boardroom in Phoenix felt like communicating across more than just geographic distance. It was bridging completely different ways of understanding what success meant. "Let me make sure I understand what you're proposing," said Robert Chen, the lead investor for the solar farm project. "Instead of a simple land purchase and development project, you want us to commit to a multi-year community partnership with educational funding, local hiring requirements, and ongoing consultation with tribal and ranching authorities." "That's correct," Sarah replied, trying to project confidence despite sitting in a kitchen that still smelled like the breakfast Jake had cooked for the three of them that morning. "The additional complexity on the front end creates substantial long-term benefits in terms of community support, regulatory cooperation, and project sustainability." "And what kind of additional costs are we talking about?" Sarah glanced at the notes she had compiled with Maria and Jake's help. Initial community consultation and partnership development would add approximately 6 months to the timeline and roughly 12% to upfront costs. However, our research suggests this approach typically reduces construction delays by 60% and virtually eliminates the kind of community opposition that has derailed similar projects in other regions. David Morrison, who was participating from his office in Phoenix, leaned forward in a way that Sarah recognized as his preparation for delivering bad news. "Sarah, while we appreciate your thoroughness in exploring community concerns, our clients need to see clear financial benefits for any additional complexity you're proposing. The community partnership components sound admirable, but they also sound expensive and difficult to quantify." "Actually," said a voice from the background of Sarah's video feed, "the financial benefits are quite quantifiable if you're willing to consider long-term rather than short-term returns." Sarah turned to see Maria entering the kitchen, carrying a folder of documents and moving with the calm authority that seemed to characterize everything she did. "I'm sorry," Robert Chen said, "but who is joining our conversation?" "Maria Yazzie," Sarah said quickly. "She's the veterinarian and community development coordinator I mentioned in my report." "Maria, I didn't expect you to be here this morning. Jake asked me to bring over some additional financial analyses that might be relevant to your presentation," Maria said, settling into a chair next to Sarah and nodding toward the laptop screen. "I hope you don't mind my joining the discussion." Sarah felt a moment of panic at the prospect of Maria's unfiltered perspective colliding with her client's business priorities, but there was no graceful way to exclude her without creating more awkwardness. "Mr. Chen," Maria said, looking directly into the camera with the kind of steady eye contact that suggested she was completely comfortable with confrontational conversations, "what's your experience with renewable energy projects in rural areas? We've completed 4 solar installations in Arizona and New Mexico over the past 3 years. And how many of those projects finished on time and under budget?" Robert Chen exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. "Construction timelines in rural areas can be challenging due to infrastructure limitations and regulatory complications." "That's a diplomatic way of saying none of them," Maria replied with a slight smile. We've done research on your previous projects, and we understand that community opposition added an average of 8 months and 23% to your costs. Sarah watched her clients' faces on the laptop screen, seeing the mixture of surprise and calculation that appeared when someone realized they were dealing with an opponent who had done more homework than they had expected. What we're proposing, Maria continued, opening her folder and pulling out charts that Sarah hadn't seen before, is a partnership structure that front-loads community consultation in order to eliminate the kinds of delays and cost overruns that have characterized rural renewable energy projects throughout the region.
And what qualifies you to make recommendations about large-scale energy development?
David Morrison asked, his voice carrying the edge that appeared when he felt his authority being challenged. I have a doctorate in veterinary medicine with specialization in range management. I serve on the County Planning Commission and the Regional Water Authority, and I've been involved in community consultation for every major development project in this area for the past 8 years, Maria replied matter-of-factly.
I'm also pregnant, which means I have a very personal interest in creating sustainable economic development that will benefit the next generation.
Sarah felt the conversation shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure she could control. Maria's pregnancy announcement seemed to change the dynamic in the room, making the discussion feel more personal and urgent.
Congratulations, Robert Chen said, his tone becoming noticeably warmer. That's wonderful news. Thank you.
It's one of the reasons I'm so committed to finding development approaches that create long-term benefits rather than short-term profits followed by long-term problems. For the next 30 minutes, Maria walked the investors through detailed analyses of comparable projects, demonstrating how community partnership approaches had affected timelines, costs, and long-term project success rates. Her presentation was more thorough and more compelling than anything Sarah could have prepared, but it also represented a level of community involvement that went far beyond what her clients had originally envisioned. This is all very impressive, David Morrison said when Maria finished her presentation, but it also represents a fundamental change in project scope and philosophy.
We're not a community development organization. We're investors looking for predictable returns on renewable energy infrastructure.
And what we're showing you, Jake said, speaking for the first time since the video call had begun, is that in rural areas, community development and infrastructure development are the same thing. You can't successfully build energy projects without building community relationships.
Sarah looked at Jake with surprise.
She hadn't expected him to join the conversation, and his quiet confidence seemed to command attention in a way that formal presentations hadn't. Mr. Hendricks, Robert Chen said, we appreciate your willingness to consider selling your land for this project. But we need to understand what kind of ongoing involvement you expect in exchange for the community partnership components Sarah and Maria have described. I don't expect ongoing involvement, Jake replied.
I expect ongoing partnership.
There's a difference.
Can you explain that difference? Involvement suggests that you're including us in your project. Partnership suggests that we're building something together that serves everyone's interests.
Sarah watched her clients' faces as they processed Jake's distinction. She could see them trying to calculate whether the difference between involvement and partnership was worth the additional complexity and potential costs. What would this partnership actually look like in practical terms? Asked Jennifer Wu, one of the investors who had remained silent during most of the conversation. Maria opened a different folder and pulled out what appeared to be a detailed organizational chart. Local hiring for construction and maintenance positions, with training programs to ensure community members have the skills needed for renewable energy jobs. Educational funding that includes renewable energy curriculum development and scholarship programs for students interested in clean energy careers. Ongoing profit sharing that provides permanent revenue streams for community development projects.
And what do you provide in return? David Morrison asked.
Land access, community support, regulatory cooperation, and local knowledge that reduces your project risks, Jake replied. Plus a model for rural renewable energy development that you can replicate in other locations. Sarah found herself watching this conversation unfold with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. Jake and Maria were presenting exactly the kind of partnership vision she had hoped to develop, but they were also committing to obligations that went far beyond anything her clients had originally considered.
We need to discuss this internally, Robert Chen said after several minutes of additional questions and answers. This is a much more complex arrangement than we typically enter into. We understand that, Sarah said, trying to regain some control over the conversation. But, we also think it represents an opportunity to demonstrate that community partnership can enhance rather than complicate renewable energy development. After the video call ended, Sarah sat in the kitchen with Jake and Maria, trying to process what had just happened. That was either the best presentation I've ever been part of or the most effective way to kill a deal I've ever witnessed, she said. Probably both, Maria replied cheerfully. But, at least now everyone knows what we're really talking about. Maria, where did all those financial analyses come from? Some of that research was more detailed than anything I've seen from professional consulting firms. I've been working on rural development issues for years. When Jake told me you were serious about community partnership, I reached out to contacts throughout the region to compile data on successful and unsuccessful projects. And the organizational charts? Those were Jake's idea. He thought it would be helpful to show your clients that we've actually thought through the practical implications of what we're proposing. Sarah looked at Jake with new appreciation. You've been planning this presentation all along. I've been thinking about what Elena would want me to do with this opportunity, Jake replied. She always said that if you're going to do something, you should do it right or not at all. And, what if my clients decide it's too complicated and walk away from the project entirely? Then, we'll find other people to work with, Maria said simply. This community has been here for generations, and it'll be here for generations more. We don't need to compromise our values for the sake of any single development project. That afternoon, while Jake was working with his cattle and Maria was at the veterinary clinic, Sarah found herself walking around the ranch property, trying to understand how her perspective on this place had changed so dramatically in less than a week. The land that she had originally seen as valuable primarily for its solar energy potential now seemed rich with history and possibility. She could see the windmill that Jake's father had built, the corrals where generations of horses had been trained, the garden area where Elena had grown vegetables and flowers. But she could also envision the solar arrays that would provide clean energy for thousands of homes, the educational facility where young people could learn about renewable energy careers, and the community center that would serve as headquarters for ongoing partnership activities. When her phone rang, Sarah was sitting on the porch where Elena used to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold. Sarah, it's Robert Chen. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Of course. Have you had a chance to discuss the partnership proposal internally? We have, and, I have to say, it's generated more discussion than any project proposal I've seen in years. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. What kind of discussion? The kind where half the room thinks we should run away from this level of complexity, and half the room thinks we should embrace it as the future of rural energy development. And, which half prevailed? Neither, yet. But, we've decided we want to move forward with a feasibility study that would allow us to explore the partnership approach more thoroughly before making a final commitment. Sarah felt relief flood through her. It wasn't the enthusiastic embrace she had hoped for, but it was permission to continue developing the ideas that had become so important to her. What would a feasibility study involve? 6 months of community consultation, regulatory review, and detailed financial analysis. We'd also want to bring in outside consultants to evaluate whether the partnership model could be replicated in other locations. And, if the feasibility study supports the partnership approach? Then, we move forward with the full project, including all the community development components you've described. After the call ended, Sarah sat on Elena's porch for a long time, watching stars emerge in the desert sky and thinking about how much her life had changed since her BMW had broken down in a flash flood. When Jake returned from his evening work with the cattle, he found her still sitting outside, wrapped in one of Elena's sweaters against the evening chill. Good news or bad news? He asked, settling into the chair next to her. Good news, I think. They want to move forward with a feasibility study for the partnership approach. That's great. How do you feel about it? Sarah considered the question seriously. Excited, scared, and completely uncertain about what happens next. That sounds about right for any worthwhile undertaking. Jake, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. What would Elena think about me being here? About me wearing her clothes and sleeping in her house and working on plans for the future of her home?
Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark landscape where cattle were settling for the night. I think Elena would be happy that her home is helping create possibilities she never could have imagined. And I think she'd be especially happy that this project is bringing together people who care about building something meaningful rather than just profitable.
Do you think she'd approve of me personally? I mean, of the way I've inserted myself into your life and your community?
Jake turned to look at her, his expression gentle but serious. Sarah, Elena spent her whole life believing that people could grow and change and become better versions of themselves if they were given the right opportunities and support. I think she'd see what's happened to you over the past week as proof that she was right. As they sat together in the comfortable silence of the desert evening, Sarah realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just a successful business project, but a community where her skills and passion could serve purposes larger than her individual success.
Jake, I've been thinking about something, and I want to run it by you before I make any major decisions. What's that? What if I relocated to Wilcox permanently? I mean, what if I opened a branch office here and specialized in community partnership development for rural projects? Jake smiled, and Sarah could see Elena's influence in his expression of quiet encouragement. I think that would be the best thing that's happened to this community in years. And I think Maria would probably offer you a job before you finished unpacking.
That night, as Sarah fell asleep in Elena's guest room, she was already making mental lists of everything that would need to happen to transform her idea into reality. She would need to convince her firm to support a rural office, she would need to find appropriate housing, and she would need to build the professional relationships that would make such a transition possible. But, for the first time since her arrival in Wilcox, Sarah wasn't thinking about obstacles and complications. She was thinking about opportunities and possibilities, and about the chance to build something meaningful with people who would become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. In the kitchen, Jake sat at the table where he and Elena had planned their own future years earlier, looking at the notes and charts that represented a very different kind of future than anything they had imagined. But, as he prepared to turn off the lights and head to bed, he found himself thinking that Elena would have loved the energy and optimism that Sarah brought to their home, and that she would have been excited about the possibilities that lay ahead for all of them. 6 months later, Sarah stood in what had once been Elena's garden, watching construction crews prepare the foundation for the Wilcox Community Energy Center. The building would serve as headquarters for the solar farm project, but it would also house educational programs, community meeting spaces, and offices for the rural development consulting practice she had established with Maria's partnership. The feasibility study had exceeded everyone's expectations, demonstrating not only that the community partnership approach was viable but that it could serve as a model for renewable energy development throughout the Southwest. 3 additional investor groups had already contacted Sarah about developing similar projects in other rural communities, and the University of Arizona had committed to funding a research center that would study the long-term impacts of community-centered energy development. But, as Sarah watched Jake directing the placement of solar panels that would soon convert desert sunshine into clean electricity, she knew that the real transformation had been more personal than professional. The woman who had driven out from Phoenix 6 months earlier to close a simple real estate deal would barely recognize the person she had become. "The panels are going to be more visible from the house than I expected," Jake said, joining her at the edge of the construction zone. "I hope Elena would approve of the way it changes the view." "I think Elena would approve of everything we've built here," Sarah replied, reaching for his hand with the naturalness that had developed between them over months of working together on plans that had grown far beyond their original scope. The relationship between Sarah and Jake had evolved slowly and carefully, shaped by respect for Elena's memory and awareness that they were building something new rather than replacing something lost. When Sarah had finally moved permanently to Wilcox, she had rented her own place in town rather than continuing to stay at the ranch. But, as their professional partnership had deepened into personal connection, they had begun spending more evenings together, planning not just the energy project but a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. "Maria's here," Jake said, nodding toward the approach road where they could see the familiar SUV raising a plume of dust as it navigated the improved access road that was one of the infrastructure improvements the project had already generated. Maria emerged from her vehicle moving more slowly than she had. 6.